We are going to get started, and I was just informed that the House may have votes as early as 4:30 rather than 6 o'clock or 5:30 when they were expecting, so I'll ask folks not to use their full amount of time if they can avoid it, and I will obey that same rule, so I'll yield myself to start. Committee comes to order. Good afternoon, welcome. We have a lot on the docket this week, and for that I want to begin by thanking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their continued efforts to develop sensible bipartisan solutions that can move through this committee and onto the House floor. 5 measures that we will vote on tomorrow are examples of the kind of legislating that we like to do best: cutting red tape, promoting American energy, making government work smarter with fewer burdens, protecting the ingenuity of the Internet, and doing all of these things by reaching across the aisle to find common ground. We'll also vote tomorrow on our semi-annual committee activity report, which chronicles all that we've accomplished together from the start of the 112th Congress through the end of last month. We've had our fair share of differences, but everyone on the committee has worked hard, everyone. And everyone has shown up, participated in hearings, contributed to our policy dialogue, engaged in the legislative process through both subcommittee and full committee markups, and through all of that, everyone has left a mark on this committee and all that we have produced. I'd like to say just a brief word on each of the measures that we're scheduled to consider tomorrow. H.R. 5865, the American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act, recognizes the importance of the American manufacturing sector in our economic recovery and continued international competitiveness. By listening to public and private sector experts, this bill will help us to eliminate red tape, streamline government processes, and ultimately make the U.S. a more competitive place to locate or expand manufacturing. I particularly want to thank Representatives Kinzinger and Lipinski for partnering to introduce the legislation. H.R. 5859 was introduced by Greg Harper and Bill Owens to strike an obsolete reporting requirement currently imposed on both NHTSA and auto dealers. Getting good information into the hands of consumers is an important goal, but it's equally important to recognize when the information is no longer useful and simply adding extra paperwork. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for recognizing that we can and we should cut back on unnecessary government mandates. The next bill that we'll consider is H.R. 4273, a bill championed by Reps. Pete Olson, Mike Doyle, and many others on the committee who have seen firsthand the challenges that occur when our power companies face conflicting obligations from both DOE, Department of Energy, and the EPA. This bill resolves those conflicts, making sure that we're able to keep the lights on without penalizing the power companies. We'll also take up H.R. 5892, a bill written by Reps. Kathy McMorris Rogers and Diana DeGette, to spur the development of new hydro projects around the country. Hydropower is an important component of all of the above energy strategy, creating jobs, and helps power our homes and businesses, and I applaud the effort to cut through the red tape in order to get more of these projects up and running. And finally, we'll vote on the House Concurrent Resolution 127, a bill introduced by Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee Chair Bono Mack, co-sponsored by members on both sides of the aisle, including myself, Mr. Waxman, Mr. Walden, and Ms. Eshoo. The resolution expresses a sense of Congress that the Internet should remain free from international regulation, and the U.S. should continue our commitment to the multi-stakeholder model of government. Once again, I thank all of my colleagues for their efforts on these bills. Our work is not done. I'm proud of what we've accomplished. I look forward to the approval of these bills and much more to come. And I would yield now to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to be here today with an agreement that took months of negotiation, compromising, learning, and understanding to produce. The substitute amendment that I will be offering, along with my colleagues Mr. Olson and Mr. Green at the full committee markup tomorrow, represents a collaborative effort. It wasn't easy, and no party got exactly what it wanted, which is how I know this is truly an excellent bill. From the very beginning, my intention was to remedy a situation whereby the federal government could require actions from a company that necessitated a choice between which law to violate. Whether emergency orders are issued once, 6 times, or 100 times, it is never acceptable to put a company in that position. However, If providing a waiver from environmental laws, it is also proper that we ensure emergency orders are not abused and encompass the necessary tools to minimize environmental impacts. This bill resolves those concerns while maintaining the ability for the Department of Energy to issue emergency orders in a timely way should an emergency arise. I want to thank Mr. Upton. I want to thank Mr. Waxman. I want to thank the co-sponsors of this bill for working together on this legislation and finding a way to get to yes. I look forward to supporting it tomorrow, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair would recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for opening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All of us know that manufacturing supports an estimated 18.6 million jobs in the United States, about 1 in 6 private sector jobs. Nearly 12 million Americans, or 9% of the workforce, are employed directly in manufacturing. Because manufacturing plays a key role for improving our economy, this bill, H.R. 5865, will help bring Made in America back to the forefront of manufacturing competitiveness. The legislation creates a board composed of private and public sector members to advise the President and Congress on short and long-term goals and recommend a plan of action. This bill repeals an obsolete provision that requires dealerships to have readily available information on insurance comparisons related to a vehicle's damage susceptibility, which is what the 1993 National Highway Traffic Safety Administration rule required. However, today's premium insurance rates depend on other criteria such as driver's locality, age, driving record, and driving frequency. Furthermore, according to the National Automobile Dealers Association, 96% of its dealers have never been asked to utilize this booklet. Moreover, as part of the committee's all-of-the-above approach to energy we'll be marking up H.R. 5892, the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act, which will provide the expanded development and use of hydropower. This legislation will help facilitate job-creating hydropower projects across the country by streamlining the licensing process and removing regulatory barriers to construction. We'll also consider H.R. 4273, the Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act, to ensure America's power companies are able to comply with DOE's emergency orders to maintain grid reliability without facing penalties for violating potentially conflicting environmental laws. This bill will amend the Federal Power Act so that power providers are not forced to choose between conflicting laws. Resolving this conflict will reduce uncertainty and help ensure the reliability of the nation's electric grid. And finally, my colleagues, today our dynamic Internet ecosystem is threatened as some countries seek to have the United Nations play a greater role in Internet governance. The United Nations, the same organization that sits China, Russia, Cuba, and North Korea on its Committee on Information, must not be charged with regulating the Internet. At a hearing last month, I questioned how many countries stood with the U.S. against those countries that seek to use regulation to fund the build out of foreign communication networks or create a regime that justifies censorship on the web. The United States must continue to garner support from other countries as a top-down approach will harm developing countries the most. Today, H.Con.Res 127 sends a clear, bipartisan message affirming that we must maintain the current multi-stakeholder, decentralized approach to Internet governance. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm proud co-sponsor of this legislation and encourage a united stance from all my colleagues against international regulation of the Internet. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair would recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Tchaikovsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup, or tomorrow's markup. I support the hydropower bill and the Internet resolution, and I hope that we can come to agreement on the grid reliability measure. I want to make a couple additional comments on the two bills that came through the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee. I am pleased with the changes that the majority agreed to on the American Manufacturing and Competitiveness Act. The new version of the legislation recognizes that the President's team has already started working on improving our manufacturing strategy and would direct the board created under H.R. 5865 to take that work into account. Building our manufacturing base has been a major focus of the administration since the President took office, so we should not be duplicating efforts. It also importantly clarifies the Board should not simply focus on eliminating regulations, but that recommendations should also be made on which federal rules should be finalized in order to give the industry more clarity and certainty. We are also considering H.R. 5859, which would repeal a requirement that the car dealers make available to consumers certain information about car insurance costs at the point of sale. I don't support H.R. 5859 as it is written. The fact that 96% of dealers have not been asked about that information doesn't mean that the information is unhelpful. It just means that consumers don't know it's there. That's not a reason to take away consumer access to information about purchases they are making. I think consideration of H.R. 5859 has raised legitimate questions about damageability information and whether the current data provided and its format and method of delivery are the most appropriate. But that's not a reason to repeal the requirement entirely. This issue deserves further scrutiny, which is why the Butterfield Amendment would direct NHTSA to take another look at what is the best information for consumers to receive about damage susceptibility on their cars. NHTSA would also examine what is the best format and method for relaying that information to individuals who are buying vehicles. My understanding is that the majority has agreed to accept the amendment, and I'm glad it will have bipartisan support. Consumers' right to know should be a basic principle this committee can agree on. And I do appreciate that on a number of these, it seems like as all the legislation we're going to be considering, that there has been bipartisan work. It's kind of a breath of fresh air, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair would recognize gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for an opening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure that you may have mentioned it, but in case some of the members don't know, the former ranking member and longtime member of this committee, Norm Lent, passed away.
We're actually going to have a moment of silence for him as we open up the markup tomorrow.
Okay. So our hearts and prayers go out to his family, and we know that he will be missed. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and Mr. Waxman for agreeing.
Gentlemen, yield for a question. Would you restate the name of the member who passed away?
Norm Lent. He was a Republican congressman from New York, from Long Island, and he served on this committee over 20 years and was the ranking member probably 10 years, approximately. He passed away last week, and his funeral is tomorrow. So the senior members would know him because we all served with him. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the 5 acts that you are the 4 bills and the 1 resolution. The National Competitive Act, H.R. 5865, H.R. 5859, the bill to repeal an obsolete provision of Title 49, H.R. 4273, the Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflict Resolution Act, H.R. 5892, the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act, and H.Con. Resolution 127, avoiding the United Nations Internet Act. These are all useful bills, and hopefully we're going to pass them on a bipartisan basis. I do want to pay special attention to the hydropower bill that's been introduced by Ms. McMorris Rogers and Ms. DeGette. There is a small hydro project, not in my district, but near my district down in Texas on Lake Livingston. I have been involved in helping to expedite this for a number of years now, and expedite may be the wrong term because it still has not been approved by the FERC, even though there is absolutely no opposition to it. The county, the city, the state, the private landowners, the Corps of Engineers, everybody's in support, and yet they still can't get the appropriate permit from the FERC. So hopefully, if the H.R. 5892 goes through the House and goes to the Senate and is signed by the President, those kind of problems will be resolved. And with that, I yield back and look forward to the markup.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's markup on 5 legislative items that have been cleared for consideration by the full committee. H.R. 5865, the American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act, and H.R. 5859 that deals with motor vehicle insurance costs reporting were both favorably reported by the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee, on which I serve as ranking. The American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act, sponsored by Mr. Lipinski and Mr. Kinzinger, seeks to establish a manufacturing competitiveness board comprised of the Secretary of Commerce, state governors, and officials from the executive branch, in addition to 10 individuals coming from the private sector. I support the bill, voted for it in subcommittee, and urge its passage today. H.R. 5859 repeals a provision of law that requires car dealers make available to prospective buyers information that compares insurance costs for different vehicles based on damage susceptibility. I would like to thank Congressman Harper, Chairman Upton, and the Republican staff for working with me to amend 5859 to require NHTSA to conduct a study that will determine the best format and method for providing damage susceptibility information to consumers. I have some concerns about H.R. 4273, the Resolving Environmental Grid Reliability Conflicts Act, and they are shared by many of our colleagues. Specifically, I'm concerned about the unintended impact a blanket waiver of environmental laws may have, as well as waiving liability for an indefinite amount of time on all requirements pertaining to environmental laws and regulations. However, notwithstanding, I will support the bill. Finally, Finally, I support the goals of H.R. 5892, the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act, and applaud the bipartisan process that created this legislation. There are several hydroelectric facilities in my home state of North Carolina that provide power to my congressional district, and this bill encourages hydropower development in rural communities like those in my district. It will also help reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. Eastern North Carolinians are facing rising energy costs during this challenging economic time, so it's critical to promote alternative energy solutions to bring down these costs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's markup will consider two pieces of bipartisan energy legislation that was reported out of the Subcommittee on Energy and Power. The first one, Resolving Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act, which is H.R. 4273 and authored by Mr. Olson of Texas, Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania, and Mr. Green of Texas, protects our nation's electricity producers from being penalized or sued for violating a conflicting environmental law when they have been directed by the federal government to operate during an emergency. The bill addresses the basic principle that the federal government should not be able to direct a generator to operate for emergency purposes and then turn around and fine them for doing so. The other bill, H.R. 5892, is the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act, which is authored by Kathy McMorris Rogers and Congresswoman Diane DeGette. This legislation has great promise for increased hydropower development across the nation. Meeting the new hydropower project demand facilitated by this bill, hopefully, will create additional construction and manufacturing jobs to help stimulate the economy. And I hope that everyone will support them. Now, yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the chair of the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee for an opening statement, Ms. Boneback.
From creating new jobs to preserving the freedom of the Internet, I strongly support all of the legislation before our committee today. But as the lead sponsor, I will focus my remarks on House Concurrent Resolution 127, as well as two bills which moved through my subcommittee earlier this year. Let me begin with jobs. Following 40 straight months of unemployment above 8%, the longest such stretch since the Great Depression, we need a new vision and a strategy for creating jobs in America. Today, nearly 23 million people around the U.S. are unemployed, underemployed, or have quit looking for work. When I became chairman of the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee, one of my goals was to create new job opportunities by making Made in America matter again. Now we have a chance for that to happen by developing a blueprint for manufacturing, which focuses on competitiveness, long-term sustainability, and making certain the U.S. is a logical first choice when it comes to locating or expanding manufacturing. The American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2012, H.R. 5865, offered by Mr. Lipinski and Mr. Kinzinger, represents Congress at its best, Republicans and Democrats sitting down and negotiating an agreement that benefits the American people. The bill brings together all of the different efforts of the federal government to enhance our manufacturing sector. But rather than just creating another agency or yet another top-down government study, this bill puts an emphasis on the involvement of people who are in the know, those in the private sector. By engaging business owners, supply chain providers, labor organizations, and the financial community, we ensure that we will get a frank assessment of what hinders the growth of U.S. manufacturing and what are the best of the best ideas when it comes to removing barriers to growth. I'd like to thank the partnership of Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Lipinski for their efforts to move this legislation forward. Another bill we will be considering, H.R. 5859, repeals an obsolete provision in the U.S. Code requiring motor vehicle insurance cost reporting. I also want to commend Mr. Harper of Mississippi and Mr. Owens of New York for their bipartisan work on this legislation. Here's the problem. In 1993, NHTSA issued a final rule requiring new car dealers to make available to buyers a booklet containing the latest information on insurance costs. The information is updated by NHTSA annually based on the data from the Highway Loss Data Institute. The information required by this regulation is rarely sought by consumers, and its value is highly questionable. Insurance premiums are based primarily on factors that are unrelated to the susceptibility of damage to a vehicle. A recent survey of 815 members of the National Automobile Dealers Association reported 96% of its dealers had never been asked by a customer to see the insurance cost booklet that is at issue. It's a senseless waste of money to continue printing information that no one requests at the dealership. And finally, I urge passage of House Concurrent Resolution 127. As the U.S. prepares to take part in the World Conference on International Telecommunications in Dubai, we need to provide the delegation with a clear and unmistakable mandate: keep the Internet free of any government control. At the WICET discussions, a new treaty on Internet governance will be debated. Most worrisome to me are efforts by some countries to provide the United Nations with unprecedented new authority over the management of the Internet. In many ways, we're facing a referendum on the future of the Internet. A vote for this resolution is a vote to keep the Internet free from government control and to prevent Russia, China, and other nations from succeeding in giving the UN unprecedented power over web content and infrastructure. That's the quickest way for the Internet to one day become a wasteland of unfilled hopes, dreams, and opportunities. I want to thank Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Waxman, Communications and Technology Subcommittee Chairman Walden, and Ranking Subcommittee Member Eshoo for their leadership in this effort. I'm also happy to report that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has just announced its strong support for our bill, which is co-sponsored by 46 members of this committee. At the end of the day, it's absolutely imperative for the United States to provide strong, unwavering leadership in Dubai, or we run the risk of saying goodbye to the Internet as we know it today. And, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a very important note that we have 49 co-sponsors now, and I just recently added my husband as a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I'm sure that will put it over the top. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start by thanking both your staff and Ranking Member Waxman's staff, along with Congressman Olson, Doyle, and Dingell's staff for diligently working over the last week to come to an agreement on H.R. 4273, the Resolving Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act of 2012. With their hard work, we will have before us tomorrow a bipartisan bill that will ensure that the electric generators are not put in the untenable position of choosing whether to ignore an emergency order or risk costly environmental litigation and fines. I'm proud of this bill because this is the type of true bipartisan legislation our committee should be focused on. I hope we will continue to work together in this way. A similarly bipartisan bill I support will be considered before our committee tomorrow as H.R. 5865, the American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2012. This legislation will create a Manufacturing Competitiveness Board charged with providing Congress and the President a short-term and long-term strategy to promote growth, sustainability, and competitiveness in our nation's manufacturing sector. I'm a co-sponsor of H.R. 5865 and voted in favor of very similar legislation 2 years ago. This is timely legislation I believe will help accelerate the recovery of our domestic manufacturing sector and return many of the middle-class jobs that have been the backbone of our nation's economy. Regarding H.R. 5859, I'm happy to see this bill gain bipartisan support and look forward to helping our nation's car dealerships while ensuring that American consumers have free access to useful data regarding damage and susceptibility and crashworthiness. Additionally, I'm pleased that we were also able to move HCR 127 through this committee. We will have very clear that the United States does not accept government control of the Internet. It's important that our government work with international organizations and countries to promote an Internet free of governmental control. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I first want to thank my colleague, Kathy Morris-Rogers, and Representative DeGette for their work on the small hydropower project bill. I think this is excellent legislation. We actually have irrigation districts that already have inline hydro systems producing power. This facilitates more of this in an easier licensing environment and is good for the economy, good for the environment, and certainly for those who implement it. I also am really delighted to support House Concurrent Resolution 127. My colleague from California, Ms. Bono Mack, has done remarkable work in this area and has led in this effort to keep the Internet free from international takeover and made this a bipartisan piece of legislation that I'm delighted to support and move out of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology in a unanimous way. You know, nations from around the world will meet at the end of this year for the Wicked, as Ms. Bono Mack said, in Dubai. There are 193 member countries of the United Nations. They'll consider applying to the Internet a regulatory regime that the International Telecommunications Union created for old-fashioned telephone service. In May, we invited a panel of witnesses, including FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell, to discuss the implications of international regulation of the Internet. The consensus was clear. Such a regime would hinder the growth not only of the Internet, but also the global economy as a whole. H.Con. Resolution 127 expresses the commitment of Congress to do all that it can to keep the Internet free from an international regulatory scheme. The Internet is the greatest driver of global development and improvement since the printing press, and despite the current economic climate, it continues to grow at a staggering pace. Cisco estimates that by 2016, roughly 45% of the world's population, 45% will be Internet users, and there will be more than 18.9 billion network connections. Average speed of the mobile broadband will be 4 times faster than it is today. So the ability of the Internet to grow at this incredible pace is due in no small part to the flexibility of the multi-stakeholder model that governs the Internet today. Non-governmental institutions now manage the Internet's core functions with input from private and public sector participants. This structure prevents governmental or non-governmental actors from controlling the design of the network or the content, and that's the important part that it carries. It's enabled the Internet that creates jobs, brings a literal world of information to your fingertips, allows small businesses from around the world to have a global reach, drives investment and innovations, even started a revolution or two. Moving away from the multi-stakeholder model would harm the Internet's ability to foster innovation, create jobs, and spread prosperity and freedom. As the U.S. delegation of WICET takes shape, H.Con.Res 127 is an excellent bipartisan demonstration of our agreement to preserve the multi-stakeholder governance model and to keep the Internet free from international regulation and those regimes who seek to control the content and use of it. I urge the committee to favorably report this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes himself for as much time as he might consume. Chairman Upton, I want to thank you for calling this markup of 5 different pieces of legislation to demonstrate the broad jurisdiction of this committee. I would like to use my brief time to focus on 2 pieces of the legislation, in particular H.R. 5865, the American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2012, and H.Con.Res 127, a resolution that endorses the current multi-stakeholder governance model of the Internet. The United States was once a leader in manufacturing. During the 1970s, 1 in 4 Americans were employed in manufacturing. Over the past 30 years, however, these industries have entered a free fall with a 40% decline from the 1979 peak. In my home state of Georgia, we have lost more than 160,000 manufacturing jobs during this time period. Mr. Chairman, there are those who have written off American manufacturing, but I am confident this sector can and will thrive again. The legislation that we have before us today will help move us in that very direction. Instead of simply relying on governmental entities to create solutions to our manufacturing problems, H.R. 5865 enlists industry experts who have firsthand knowledge of the challenges that face the industry on a daily basis. This legislation will do so by creating a public-private American Manufacturing Competitiveness Board, drawn mostly from the private sector, to provide recommendations to the President and to the Congress on how to best revitalize this critically important sector of our economy. Additionally, the board created by H.R. 5865 will help manufacturers implement strategies on the biggest obstacles facing the industry: burdensome federal regulations and bureaucracy. It's long past time that we rely on industry experts to help guide manufacturing policy. During my tenure in Congress, I have regularly convened a manufacturing advisory committee in the 11th Congressional District of Georgia to give me perspective of what is occurring on the ground level for these job creators. After each of these meetings, I walk away knowing that I am better informed on these industry challenges. I am particularly glad that H.R. 5865 embodies this very model that I have found to be so very successful. Mr. Chairman, I commend the leadership of the authors of this legislation, Mr. Lipinski and Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois, for working in a bipartisan manner to create and craft legislation that will help put in place a strategy to rejuvenate manufacturing in this country. And I urge all of my colleagues, please support H.R. 5865. Mr. Chairman, I also want to briefly speak to the importance of H.Con.Res 127. As a co-sponsor of this legislation and member of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, I'm an ardent supporter of the current multi-stakeholder governance model of the Internet. The Internet has proven to be the largest economic engine in the 21st century economy. Yet, despite these successes, international organizations like the UN and International Telecommunications Union seek to grab control over the Internet through global regulations. I believe this country should stand its ground on governance of the Internet and not allow it to fall into the hands of the international community. I urge my colleagues, support H.Con.Res 127, and I yield back my time. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and glad you were able to take the time that you needed. I was happy to yield you more if you needed some, but I do want to thank you for bringing all of these bills before our committee today, and I strongly support all of the legislation that our committee is hearing today will be voting on tomorrow, and I urge that we report all of these favorably. I'd specifically like to talk about a bill that I'm co-sponsoring, and that's H.Con.Res 127 by Ms. Bono Mack, who's here with us today and gave a great explanation of her resolution. And it's a very timely resolution because the UN is currently considering proposals for a takeover of the Internet. If you look at the successes we've had in our economy, one of the bright spots has been the technology arena, and in large part because of, not only because of the Internet, because of the fact that government hasn't figured out how to regulate the Internet. And of course, in many cases, we've seen some proposals that we've been concerned about the United States government looking at putting some limitations on the Internet, and luckily we've been able to fight those off. But I think what would really concern people the most is if you had foreign countries coming in and trying to take over the governance of the Internet. And again, it's been so successful because it's a multi-stakeholder system where no government has control. In fact, FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell wrote recently in the Wall Street Journal about this threat, the United Nations threat to Internet freedom is the title of it, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that he points out is that Vladimir Putin last year said that his goal, and this is the Russian president, his goal of himself and his allies is to establish international control over the Internet through this proposal that's working its way through the United Nations. And so I think as most of us who fight for freedom, who cherish freedom, not just in the United States, but as America's the beacon of democracy throughout the world, one of the things we've been able to do is help spur, through social media in many cases, a higher level of accountability of governments all throughout the world. And in fact, I think one of the things you've seen with the Arab Spring, one of the things you've seen in countries like Russia, you've been able to have more uprisings of people who stand up for their own human rights and are able to hold their governments accountable because of the freedom of the Internet. And I think we all recognize that if the United Nations was to yield control, to take control away from this multi-stakeholder process and bring it under the control of governments, then you would have countries like Russia, as they're expressing their desire, and also other countries like China, that would be able to shut down those public uprisings of holding those governments accountable, of trying to promote democracy throughout the world. You look at the history of the United Nations, and so many times recently we've seen a lot of anti-American activity coming out of the United Nations, and not just anti-American, but also against America's allies like Israel. In fact, 40% of the UN's Human Rights Council resolutions have been aimed at condemning Israel. And so they spend more of their time attacking Israel than they do actually attacking real problems throughout the world to defend human rights. So I think it shows you that it would be very dangerous for the United Nations to get control over the Internet. That's why I'm so glad that Ms. Bono Mack and all of us that are co-sponsoring are taking the lead in saying we're going to block a United Nations takeover of the Internet and make sure that that does not happen. And I hope we are able to pass that out to the full House, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The votes have been called on the floor, so I would encourage members to utilize their time, all the time if they need to, but if not, make it brief. And I'll now represent for 3 minutes, so I'll yield to the gentleman from Mississippi for his opening statement, Mr. Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be the lead sponsor of H.R. 5859, a one-page bipartisan bill being considered today, which repeals an obsolete mandate that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has said is rarely used and not helpful. Since 1991, the Department of Transportation has annually distributed by mail a document entitled Relative Collision Insurance Cost Information. This information is sent by mail to new vehicle dealers who are required to make this information available to prospective new vehicle customers upon request. While this information is of value to insurance actuaries, it has been of little to no use for consumers for whom it is primarily intended. No brochure produced annually by the federal government can accurately gauge a prospective new car owner's insurance premium. When customers come into a dealership and ask what their insurance premium will be, it's agreed that the best way to get an accurate quote is for them to simply contact their insurance agent. This simple and bipartisan bill, if passed, would show that Congress is serious about efforts to alleviate burdensome and unneeded regulations on businesses across the country. I'd like to thank the chairman and this committee for moving H.R. 5859, and I'd also like to thank Congressman Bill Owens from New York for his hard work and leadership on this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to extend a personal note of thanks to Chairman Upton and Energy and Power Subcommittee Chairman Whitfield for their commitment to finding a resolution of the concerns of members and working to ensure grid reliability for all Americans. We're bringing H.R. 4273, the Resolving Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act of 2012, before the full committee tomorrow. Members on both sides of the aisle agree that this is a critically important piece of legislation. Congress needs to clarify that compliance with an emergency order issued by the Department of Energy to maintain grid reliability should not be considered a violation of any federal, state, or local environmental laws or regulations. And I particularly want to thank my colleagues, my fellow Texan, Mr. Green, Congressman Doyle, as well as Ranking Member Waxman and Chairman Emeritus Dingell, for working closely with the majority to reach a bipartisan agreement on a way to clarify what has always been our intent, to minimize the negative environmental impacts that may result from maintaining grid reliability during an emergency. Tomorrow, I intend to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute that reflects our agreement. The amendment will retain the main pieces of this bill. It simply adds a new provision which implements a 90-day expiration date on an emergency order if it conflicts with environmental law. Under the new language, DOE can reissue the order as long as they consult with the appropriate environmental regulator to consider ways to minimize environmental impact. Importantly, DOE retains final approval. DOE retains final approval for any proposed conditions to ensure the emergency doesn't result in a blackout. H.R. 4273 is an important solution that protects energy consumers, the environment, and those who provide the power. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman and now recognizes the co-author of the bill for 3 minutes for his opening statement, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to first thank Chairman Upton for encouraging members of this committee to work across the aisle on issues of importance. We can get a lot more done if we start with a bipartisan foundation in support of pro-growth policies. The 5 bills we're marking up today take an aim at a variety of those issues with those goals in mind. I'm proud to speak in support of the American Manufacturing Competitiveness Act of 2012. I want to thank Chairman Bono Mack and Ranking Member Butterfield and members of the subcommittee who helped to move this legislation to the full committee. A national manufacturing strategy is essential for ensuring government policies are not inhibiting job growth. This legislation will improve our global competitiveness, which is essential for supporting a pro-growth environment and ensuring a strong manufacturing sector for the next several decades. A manufacturing renaissance is at hand. With the passage of this legislation, we're laying the foundation for long-term job growth. I also want to speak in support of the Strategic Energy Production Act of 2012. I want to thank Mr. Olson for his leadership on this bill, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation. With this legislation, we want to ensure that power utilities are able to continue operating in an emergency situation without being penalized by the EPA or sued by a third party. We need to pass this legislation to ensure that when 2 government agencies give contradictory orders to a power utility, everyone knows which order supersedes the other. And lastly, the World Conference on International Telecommunications is set to take place this December. At risk in this conference is the transparency and control of the Internet itself. Authoritarian regimes around the world have been looking for new ways to quash dissent, which has spread so quickly thanks to the web, and they're trying to use this conference as a means towards changing the successful multi-stakeholder model that governs the Internet today. The very thing the U.S. is fighting for is openness, yet with all negotiations being held behind closed doors, even though there's no classified information being discussed. It wasn't until a team of researchers from George Mason University set up a website for the purpose of having someone with access to those documents upload them for the world to see that we were finally able to see the full picture. A picture that shows the true intention of those authoritarian regimes who are scared of letting their people access an open and free Internet. It's my hope that the U.S. negotiators will push for and make publicly available all the proposals being put forward so that the world can see exactly what it is we all face at the December conference. I support passage of H.Con.Res 27 to declare to the world the importance of an open and free Internet. I look forward to tomorrow's markup, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair asks for unanimous consent to introduce for the record the opening statement of Ranking Member Waxman. Hearing none, so ordered. The chair calls up H.R. 5859 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 5859, to repeal an obsolete provision in Title 49 United States Code requiring motor vehicle insurance cost reporting.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. For the information of the members, we are now on H.R. 5859. The committee will reconvene at 10 o'clock a.m. tomorrow. I remind members that the chair will give priority recognition to amendments offered on a bipartisan basis. Look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. Without objection, the committee stands in recess.